In this video, we'll take a look at the ASNA DataGate Monitor. The DataGate Monitor is a freestanding utility available from the ASNA Downloads page. The DataGate Monitor is a freestanding executable. It does not require Visual Studio, and its primary purpose is to allow you to add, change, or delete database names on end-user computers, such as Windows 10 if you've deployed a FAT client and you need to create a database name on those machines, or Windows servers if you need to create a database name for a web application. This is something that could be done with the DataGate Studio that lives inside Visual Studio, but that's not something that's convenient to install on these end-user machines, and the DataGate Monitor is very easy to install. Now, there are some differences which we'll take a look at. Now, the DataGate Monitor does have a few operations for managing connections, understanding the number of jobs, creating and repairing local databases, but primarily its aim is to let you manage database names on end-user desktops and Windows servers. It doesn't require Visual Studio, and it is available as a separate download at the URL you see there. The DataGate Monitor's precursors are either the Database Manager for COM or DataGate Studio, also known as DataGate Explorer for .NET. We'll take a look at each right here. Here's the old COM Database Manager. Let's just open a database. Let's just open this one here. So there we can open databases. We can create database names. We can work with database names and create them. We can also open files and work with the data. Do minor, simple little queries. Those are things that the DataGate Monitor cannot do. The monitor does not let the end users get to data. It's only an administrative piece for creating database names and some other minor administrative things. But there is no ability to get to data files in the DataGate Monitor. So this is the COM Database Manager. And then we also have in .NET, we have View DataGate Explorer, also known as DataGate Studio. Well, the DataGate Studio is a separate install. That can be downloaded separately and installed into Visual Studio. So what this might be good for is if you are using the ASNA Windows-hosted local database for production purposes, you might need a database management tool on a server. Something that lets you modify files, work with the data, maybe fix or repair the data. So it may be convenient to install Visual Studio and the DataGate Studio on that Windows data server. If it's a Windows server for, say, a web application and you're using DataGate for SQL Server or DataGate for the IBM I, and all you need to do is manage database names, well, the DataGate Monitor is probably a better tool for that. It doesn't need Visual Studio. DataGate Studio, like the COM Database Manager, it lets us look at data. It lets us go into files, change things, stuff like that. DataGate Monitor, again, doesn't let us get into that data like that. So we'll put this up. We're kind of done with that. Let's turn our attention to database names for just a moment and the differences between COM and .NET database names. In the early days of Windows, it was a best practice to store application configuration data in the Windows registry. So COM database names are stored in the registry. However, using the registry for that kind of thing kind of dropped out of style with the advent of Windows 7, give or take. And so now we store database names in files named DataGate config. So we'll take a look at this a little closer. Now, before we look at the database names, one last thing. Let's review for a second the concept of public and private database names. This is a concept that applies both to COM and .NET. The essential difference is that public database names are available to any user account signed into Windows. Public database names must be used for web apps and web services. Typically, private database names are reserved for FAT Windows clients. And you can use public names for FAT clients, but it's often private database names are used. Now, when we work with database names in the DataGate Monitor, which we'll take a look at here in a second, it uses these different icons to identify database names. It uses the chevron with the stripes to indicate a .NET public database name. It uses the chevron without the stripes, a solid chevron, to indicate a .NET private database name. And then COM database names are shown as the little file cabinet with the striped chevron, or private COM databases are the solid gray chevron with the file cabinet. The DataGate Monitor can show you COM database names, but it does not let you work with them or edit them or change them, but it does show them to you. Notice that the gray text shows where these database names are persisted. So for example, the public .NET database name is persisted to a file that lives in the all users ASNA DataGate config file. Now let it register that all users folder is a Windows synonym for the program data folder. I don't know why Windows does that, but you can refer to it as either all users or just purely C program data. I think it owes to some history with Windows 7. There isn't really a physical all users directory. It's a link to the C program data folder. Let's take a look at this in the DataGate Monitor. So in this screen, we'll start up the DataGate Monitor. It's in the ASNA program group. It starts itself as an administrator, so you don't need to do that. And now here we are with the view. It's a pretty simple view, not very busy. We'll open up all sources, and that's all the database names on this machine. So you can see then the .NET public, the COM public, the .NET private, and the COM private database names. Now remember that we can view COM database names, but we can't change them in the DataGate Monitor. Now that we know what those icons are for the database names, let's create a couple of database names. Let's first create one for that local database that we just created. So I'll right-click Sources, All Sources, and I'm going to create a public database name. So we'll pretend like this is going to be for a web app using that local database. And I'll click OK. And now it wants to know the server name. So on a local database, you click Browse and go out and find that database name. Now there might be other machines listed here on the network, or you might put in a TCP/IP address to explicitly add one to that list, because we can have local databases across the network. In my case, I want the database on the local machine, and I want to use that database that we labeled Acme Production. So I'll click OK, and it populates the server is my local machine, and the label is Acme Production. Now for a local database, that's fine. And typically for a local database, we want to use the Windows Domain Authentication, and we're pretending like this is a web app. Web apps are what would use pool connections. In fact, clients do not use pooled connections. So we're pretending this is a web app. I'll say pooled connections. And that's pretty much all there is for the local database. Now we'll take a look at advanced properties here in just a minute. But let's go ahead and test this connection. And it works. So if I click Apply, now I've got a database name here that I can use to get to that local database we just created. Now, that's a local database name. And that label had to match what the deployed label of that local database was from that previous create database step. Now let's create another database name. This one for the IBMI. And this will be very similar for DataGate for SQL Server as well. We'll start just like we did before. I'm going to call this one Zimmerman. I'm going to click OK. And in this case, I created a public database name again, so it would be for a web app. Now the server in this case would either be the IP address or the server name of either the server that has the IBMI or DataGate for SQL Server installed on. In our case, we know that the server name is Cypress in the network. We could also here put an IP address as well. Now if we're doing the IBMI, the label can be anything we want here. My database connection. You can put anything there you want. If it's a SQL Server database, you're going to click this checkbox, and when you do, it hard codes SQL as the label. Well, we're doing a local, the IBMI, so let's just make it say IBMI DB. Now typically on the IBMI, not typically, always on the IBMI, you would use server-based authentication. And usually on DataGate for SQL Server, you would use either Windows domain authentication or server-based, depending on how your SQL Server is configured. So we're using the IBMI server-based authentication. We need to give it the user profile and password. We did pretend like this is a web app database name. Now, we didn't use the advanced properties a minute ago. Let's use them now, because there's a few things there that we might need to change. The most notable would be the TCP/IP port. For the local database and for DataGate for SQL Server, it will default to 1542 and you leave it at 1542. For the IBMI, it defaults to 1542 because by default, the DataGate for IBMI install puts it at 5042, but it's changeable at installation time. I know that we have many instances of DataGate on this IBMI, so I'm going to change that to port 5150. Now otherwise, most of these chunks of text here are repeating what was on that previous screen. The one other thing that's here, there's two other things here that are interesting. The first of which is the secure password. Now for the local database or DataGate for SQL Server, actually for the local database, you just leave it at legacy ADB because you're not going to have a secure login. But for DataGate for SQL Server, it's going to be left at legacy ADB password as well. Now for the IBMI, it would either be secure password if the IBMI is using the secure password feature that was introduced for the IBMI 6 or 7 years ago. That's basically the long password they enabled. So if your IBMI is using the long password, set it to secure password. I think generally most IBMIs today are requiring that secure password. I'd be very surprised if you've got one that isn't. But if it's the old style, an old one, it would be legacy. That basically means a 10-character or less standard password. But we're going to use secure password because our IBMI has that on it. Now the other thing that's interesting here is you might want to change the initial library list, so you can give it a list of libraries there. Otherwise we're done. Let's test it. And it says it works, so that's good. I'll apply it. So there we've got Zimmerman and Exceller and Acme DBs. That's how to create database names. Now there's a few other things you can do here. One thing you can do is you can select a database name. Let's take Acme. We know that's a local database. And here you can repair the database or repair and force an index rebuild. Now this is only for the local database. The local database is kind of a volatile database, especially if somebody turns off the machine inappropriately. And so these are options that would stepwise repair that database. Typically, you would most often just do a repair and force index rebuild. Sometimes that takes a long time, and I accidentally repaired that one. I didn't need to. So sometimes you can try the repair database first, and if that doesn't work, do this. But do remember that with the local database, it's not like the IBMI or DataGate for SQL Server, and it's not as robust. Keep good copies of that local database because it can get corrupted, power outages, things like that. And these are backup tools to try to bring one back from a corruption. The other thing that we can do here, mostly for the local database, let's go to the local database manager, the COM database manager, and let's open up something. Let's just, we've got one open right here. So I'm just going to open this guy so I can see him. There we go. So I've got a connection open there. Now what I'm going to do is go to this local guy here and look at his jobs. I expand the database name and look at jobs. So there we can see that I've got this job running out there on the local database. So this jobs thing here is a little bit for the local database, like the IBMI and SQL Server tools for looking at jobs there. On the IBM I, it would be work active job or work user job. And on SQL Server, it would be its activity monitor. So there's no tools like that for the local database, so we've put some into the DataGate Monitor. These tools would show you some information for the IBM I and DataGate for SQL Server, but we don't recommend you use it for that. It's not good for that. Those other tools specifically for the IBM I or SQL Server are much better for that. Use those native tools there. But if you need to worry about jobs on the local database, this is pretty handy. It can also show you record locks and physical members that are out there and opened up. Mostly it's good for making sure that your license counts are correct. That's pretty much what question this might answer for the local database. Don't use it for the IBM I or SQL Server. So that is a quick look at the DataGate Monitor. It is installed. Let's take a look at where you get it. If you go out to ASNA.com and be sure to create a free account, and once you've created a free account and logged in, then you can go to Downloads. You can go to the family of products you want. In this case, we're going to go to 15. And there then is the freestanding DataGate Monitor. So you can download it from there and install it, and it'll work like you saw in this video. So thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate it. Check out the DataGate Monitor, especially if you need to manage database names for end user Windows machines and web servers. Thank you.